If a game is not fun, then why bother? These wise words from the great American Shigeru Miyamoto could not be any more true. Video games should, to some degree, be fun. And the gateway to fun in a video game starts with how it controls. Like, your game can look as pretty as you want, but if I have to play Ninja Gaiden with a freaking Sega Saturn controller, then I'm out. I think video game controllers can often be taken for granted. You kind of just expect games to play how you would imagine they would play. And thankfully, it's usually within the first couple of minutes that a player has all of the basic inputs down pat. I don't want to sit through a goddamn 30-hour tutorial, I just want to start pressing buttons and popping caps in food. Bad controls can completely ruin a game, because controls are the only power the player really has. And as soon as you take that power away, well, I don't really want to play your game anymore. There's no real right way to do controls. And what determines good and bad controls is a bit of a hard thing to narrow down, because it's really up to a matter of personal preference. But a very large majority of games have gotten the controls right, regardless of what controller it makes you use. There's a pretty basic button layout that a majority of games default to, varying by the genre. Left stick to move the camera, right stick to move the character, and bottom button to jump. Using the triggers to accelerate and brake or aim and shoot just feels right. Yeah, I like that. Game controls were pretty basic when everything could only move in a 2D environment. Up, down, left, right, jump and shoot, and that was pretty much it. But with the coming of more advanced 3D games, controls had to become more advanced as well to adapt to a 3D environment. And eventually, they did. It took some time. Quite some time, but I think we've gotten to the point where games are pretty easy to pick up and play because the controls are so similar to games that came before it. For me, the hardest part of playing older games is having to adjust to the, not so great controls. I think controls can be what aged the most poorly. Aside from the graphics, which never look as good as you remember them. Though, I do think it goes to show how well video games have improved upon the handling of controls over time. Most of the time, I'd say bad controls stem from forcing the player to use a gimmick to play the game. Looking at you, Nintendo DS. Super Mario 64 is one of my favorite games of all time. And despite having to play it on one of the weirdest looking controllers of all time, look, I love the N64 controller, but seriously, what? I think aside from the camera controls wanting to make me blow my brains out, the game holds up pretty well. The same can be said about the DS remake, except for one tiny itty bitty little problem. The controls are kind of bad. Because the original DS only has directional buttons, there's no real way to move Mario around in a 3D environment. Diagonal movement was essentially impossible. So, some genius at Nintendo thought using the touchpad to move the characters would be a good idea. It isn't. Luckily, the 3DS fixed this problem by having a beautiful circle pad, and bam, problem solved, now it's perfect. Now, you can actually move characters in a 3D environment, just like in the original version, but this time you can play as Wario. Mario 64 DS was one of my favorite games as a kid, but I have no idea how I put up with the horrible controls before I played it on the 3DS, because, I just can't go back to it. Take that, touchscreen. Other great games pretty much ruined by the exact same DS gimmick were Metroid Prime Hunters and Zelda the Phantom Hourglass that forced you to use the stylus on the touchpad to move Link or the camera around. I can't even put into words how annoying this is. Acceptable use of the touchscreen as a menu or an inventory or a map even. Unacceptable use of the touchscreen. Anything else. Though the 3DS fixed a lot of things, it wasn't exactly immune to gimmicks either. Case in point, Kid Icarus Uprising. Great graphics, fantastic characters, overall pretty good game, but really shit controls. Yeah, you sort of get used to it after a while, but it's still incredibly awkward and cumbersome to play, and I'm still feeling the hand pains a week after I stopped playing it. I know the internet's already had its round of complaining about Icarus's controls, but I only played the game a week ago, and I am outraged. Why, Shiggy? Why would you do this to me? The characters are wonderful, the graphics look really great for a system where I'm used to everything looking like this, and the game overall should be brilliant, so why did they do this with the controls? For those who haven't had the pleasure of being ripped off by this game, you have to use the stylus to move the camera around, while using the circle pad to move Pit around, and the R trigger to shoot. So you end up looking like this while playing it. Help. The air stages aren't so bad with these controls since you don't need to worry about moving the camera. But as soon as it gets to the ground levels, Don't get me wrong, I still persevered the hand cramps and beat the game because it's awesome, but I just think Uprising could have been so much better without the crappy controls. Now, get this. How about instead, holding the triggers moves the camera back just like in Mario 64. Pit still moves with the circle pad, but now you use the buttons to attack. There, I just made you $30 worth it. I wanted to love you, damn it. No, I do love you, but reluctantly. And speaking of gimmicks, then there's the Antichrist of video game controls. Ugh. Motion controls. Ugh. I have no idea whether this is an unpopular opinion or not, but I absolutely despise motion controls. The only acceptable use for me is mini games or games where they're not entirely required. As I said, I know many may disagree with me, but I figured the whole point of motion controls was to simplify game control schemes, and yet they sure as hell don't do that. Not always, but mostly. The Wii comes to mind as being the console that basically pioneered the popularity of motion controls, with games like Wii Sports that were so brilliant mainly because of the motion controls. Swinging the Wiimote to hit the ball in tennis for that brief, beautiful moment made me think that I could actually play sports. For that sweet, sweet moment. Mario Galaxy 2 with its spin attack was super satisfying to use. But Mario Kart Wii was just... no. Another exception to this dreaded motion control curse is Punch-Out for the Wii, where the motion controls really add to the experience. Each punch actually requires movement, so you feel a lot more involved. I mean, yeah, you can be a loser and turn them off and play with the buttons, but it's nowhere near as exhilarating. Sure, they don't work all the time. Looking at you, bold bull, I'll kill your whole family. But I think this is one of the few times where I actually preferred using the motion controls. They can actually be used for good. And though Nintendo aren't the only people to use them, they certainly do have a very interesting track record of hit and misses. Skyward Sword is often considered one of the worst Zelda games, and the most common complaint people had was that the game forced you to use motion controls. Now, I liked the game, but I don't like how the controls don't work half the time. I don't think I have to say much about the Wii U aside from Star Fox Zero. You know what I'm talking about. When the Switch was announced, I prayed it wouldn't have motion controls, but I wasn't surprised when it did. This is Nintendo, after all. I'm glad they weren't essential for every game because they were kind of a mess. Games like Mario Odyssey had extra moves that required motion controls, but I could not get them to work for the life of me. Rest of the game, masterpiece. Motion controls, be gone! And then there's ARMS, the best, worst game I've ever played. Using motion controls, this game is an absolute mess, and I must be doing something wrong, right? To counteract these sins upon humanity came Splatoon 2, the bestest game ever made. That's a fact, not an opinion, don't at me. The first Splatoon on the Wii U was fine, but because you had to move this thing to move the camera, I felt like I was having a freaking workout. Feel the burn. But because the Switch uses a much smaller controller, it was easier to move the camera, and because of that, Splatoon 2 is one of the smoothest and most satisfying games I've ever played. The rest of the buttons are really well placed, so playing this game is super duper fun. This is where I like motion controls, when they assist the controls and not take them over completely. Oh, it's so good. Also, Splatoon gives you a bunch of other control schemes to use, just in case you don't like the motion controls. I can think of a game that could learn from that. And of course, then there's the Kinect. I don't have all that much experience with this thing, but I think we can all agree that having no controller at all was definitely not the future that gaming was looking for. Cool gimmick, sure, but the games I played with it really weren't all that fun, and you kind of look like a bit of a dumbass while playing it. Then there's PC. Mouse and keyboard certainly is a bit of a change from a more comfortable and straightforward controller, and I know I for one took a very long time to adjust to it. Because now you have like a bajillion buttons, and I know for a fact that I'm not the only one who forgot every other control except WASD and the spacebar. What they do allow for though is a much greater customization to suit the controls to your own liking. Even if it takes a billion years to do so, a lot of the time this can work out great. Sometimes though, they can be Dark Souls for PC. My personal favorite control scheme so far that I've played for mouse and keyboard comes from Enter the Gungeon. The controls in this game are absolutely perfect. WASD to move, Q and space for items, mouse to aim, left click to shoot, and right click to roll. The controls are the best part of the game because they let you quickly move around the screen and shoot your enemies to pieces. It's glorious. Now, if only you didn't have to start all the way from the start of the game whenever you die, it would be perfect. This is what I would call good controls. Super responsive, easy and convenient, and super satisfying to play. The best kind of controls are easy to pick up but challenging to master, that allow for super quick and fluid gameplay that don't require you to glance at the controller every 5 seconds, and just make you feel like you're really good at it. Yeah, I did that. Smash Bros, good controls. Ratchet & Clank, good controls. Mario Odyssey, Uncharted, Dark Souls, Platinum games, they're just all really, really good controls, man. Classic games like GoldenEye 64 and Tomb Raider, bad controls, at least in comparison to now. People just put up with it because they didn't really have another choice, and that's why a lot of people remember Ocarina of Time as being way easier to control than it actually is. I was the exact same as a kid. I almost beat Sonic Adventure DX with a mouse and keyboard. I don't even know how, but what I do know is that I deserve a goddamn medal for it. After a while, the controller should be an extension of the player. The two of us, we're connected. Controls, after a while, should feel more like basic movement instead of pressing a bunch of buttons. And this is where I think motion controls went wrong. They tried to skip that step, but ended up falling down the goddamn stairs. Sometimes bad controls are used as the gimmick of the game, like Surgeon Simulator or Octodad or Getting Over It, where the bad controls assist with making it easier for you to decide to throw your PC out the window. It's intentionally frustrating. Yeah. Then there's games like Resident Evil, where half of the game's tension is because your character can only move at the same speed as a depressed Snorlax. And yeah, when it's used like that, it's all well and good, but it doesn't make it any less annoying to play. Long story short, controls are important, gimmicks are not. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go back to playing Splatoon 2. So, see ya.